Climate change is probably the biggest single political issue that will determine the survival of the entire human species on planet Earth. With the increasingly damaging natural disasters nature striking back only being the tip of the metaphorical iceberg that will soon be melted and wash us away like a flood. Even with such a dramatic introduction, 99.9% of scientists agree that this is an impending catastrophe that we need to take action on sooner rather than later before it is too late. Still, it seems to me that we are treating these doomsayer scientists as the doomsayers that would say that the world was going to end after 2012, and yet here we are. It can seem especially demotivating for young people to know that the current politicians do not seem to care nearly as much about our top issue, while for us we are going to have to deal with the world that they are going to leave behind. And we cannot afford to wait our turn for 30 more years, because by then the climate goals of net zero by 2030 would have failed, because more and more policymakers are starting to go back on their promises on that one. And while there are many reasons why politicians do not act the way that people want them to act, those are topics for other videos. But all of those different reasons can come back to a first realization that we're talking about today. During my studies, I realized something very important about us tackling climate change, and that is going to limit every single action that we might take in the future. Because the fundamental thing that will keep us from actually tackling climate change effectively is our current understanding of our relationship to nature. To explain it, I'm going to take you on a journey throughout a few cultures and what they think their relation to nature is. Compare that to ours, and that'll show exactly why we need to have such a radical shift in the way that we think before we can even envision what is necessary to tackle climate change. And I'm going to say respectfully beforehand that I'm not an expert on any of these cultures in particular, and I would love to learn more about it. So if you know more about it, put it down in the comments so we can talk about it. I'm just trying to give a surface level understanding so the topic of climate change becomes easier to understand. Let's start somewhat familiar. Throughout Western history, we've mostly had Christian theology, the idea that God gave us man the earth, and therefore man has dominion over earth and everything on it. Our morality of humans are above everything else. The world is our oyster, so to speak, so we can do with it whatever we want. In that worldview, humans are at the center of the universe. This worldview is the basis for many different ways of expanding, like empires, spreading the glory of the Roman Empire, or the Holy Land around Jerusalem, or the Americans having to go westward to conquer the country with manifest destiny. All of this is not just for economical reasons that we've seen and we will treat many different times during the channel. But the worldview that needs to happen in the first place is based on a sort of this theology. Even without the holy invocations of saying this is because God needs us to do it, when we later got science and rationality around the Enlightenment era, still science can still become a tool for those who already believe in their heart of hearts that we as humans need to conquer the world. So we can think of many different metrics that could justify why it is good or reasonable or logical to start conquering the earth and use the most amount of resources that we can to become a bigger as a species. Same with when humans are the center of the universe, we can also use science and rationality to justify why we believe some creatures to be worth killing and some creatures to not be worth killing. For example, we can say that some elephants are very important to keep because they are smarter, they are more intelligent, they have shown sentience, so to speak, and that bugs are not as interesting and therefore we can get rid of them quite easily. But these kinds of distinctions and these kinds of ways that we justify our need to conquer the world are, well, Christian theology. There are other ways to look at it as well, because the Japanese have a sort of religion called Shinto that has like 5 million practitioners now to date, and that is present in many of the different Miyazaki films that you can see with My Neighbor Totoro and stuff. Shinto religion believes then that the land itself around us carries a spiritual energy or actual spirits called kami that are all part of this one divine fabric of reality. We are all one, and therefore when we start to conquer nature or try to cut down all the trees, nature can strike back with evil spirits, or we would actually disturb the balance. So fundamentally, they believe that our relationship to nature is that we should preserve it as we are all one, and otherwise we are intruding upon it. In many types of anime and many types of media, you can see this go even when people are not necessarily Shinto. It's a very old Japanese trope that is still very important to the way that they conceive of themselves. You can imagine these shrines that are very typically Japanese. All of it being connected into one divine fabric of reality means that there are many manifestations of the kami, the spirits, which can be evil or can be good. They can cohabitate with us or they cannot. But they do not make a distinction like we do as in the West with animals, saying these animals are more important, this nature is more important than not, because they're all part of the same fabric of reality. Of course, with this religion, the logical conclusion would then be that we humans should live in harmony with the land. Similar to the Japanese Shintoism, Native American tribal cultures also used to have a fairly similar way of looking upon their relationship to nature. I would more call it like a stewardship, that they are guardians of nature or they live in harmony with nature. What they have in common is that they believe that the land is valued in and of itself and needs to be preserved, as they, as humans, are only one small part of the larger ecosystem, not necessarily more important. Therefore, unlike Shintoism, it doesn't have as much religious connotations. It's more like a lore of the land. It's important to know that they see themselves more like part of the larger organism of the world and therefore play their part in it. Of course, the land helps them survive and they should survive on the land. It provides them the food and the berries and the animals that they sometimes need to slaughter, but you shouldn't take more than you need, and therefore there's a very big emphasis on not wasting anything that you need to get. Think about if you do have to kill an animal in order to feed, you should use the bones, you should use the skin, you should use the flesh, you should use the antlers for adornments and stuff. All of it is important because if you believe that nature is worthwhile in and of itself and that you are only part of nature, then of course you can interact with nature. You sometimes do have to kill in order to survive, but you make sure that you don't do it willy-nilly because it is, fun or profitable for you. Be it you do it because it is necessary. The idea would be not to deform the land permanently in any way. You do not want to be too much of a burden on the ecosystem at any place. You have to maintain the balance. This means in practice that when you start hunting animals, that you do not overhunt them to the point that they will die out. They won't have the means to procreate to a stable level. That would also be quite stupid because you would hunt them to the point that you won't have any food in the future. You don't want to exhaust the area that you're in and therefore you start moving around. Nature sometimes needs time to regrow. If you pluck all the berries, then it might take a few seasons to regrow those same berries and then you can come back. Trekking around the land helps you to not only preserve the ecosystem, but to make sure that you don't put too much pressure at any point at any given time. You can imagine then also that you are more subject to the elements. You are at the mercy of the elements because you do not want to permanently deform the land. Unlike Western farmers, especially during the Industrial Revolution, farming did happen, and so people settled in cities and states and were not nomadic. They were less dependent on the elements themselves, on favorable weather conditions, because you could cultivate many different types of crops, some that needed more water and some that needed less water. If you were more nomadic, then of course you're going to have to not only be more adaptable in your diet, because some animals will not be around for very long if you hunt them in some area, but also some fruits of the ground naturally will not be around if you stick around. It's very corny, but the essence of this kind of stewardship idea of Native Americans can be that you are all part of the circle of life that connects all things. You come from the earth and you return to the earth when you die. Because these tribes were often more dependent on the elements, they would have more shamanistic rituals, as you can imagine, that they could have totems and they had shamans that tried to appease the spirits, calling for rain, for favorable winding conditions. This might sound a bit oogie boogie, but it is something that all kinds of cultures have done in some form or another throughout history. You can imagine how the Greek and Romans used to pray to their gods or give them offerings in order to have favorable tides of battle or have favorable conditions in love. Or imagine that there are Maya or Aztec people that sacrificed humans in order to appease the sun god because they were afraid that the sun would stop burning if they stopped doing so. There are many different cultures, from primitive, ancient, or modern cultures even, that do all kinds of weird things to appease an imaginary or real god or not. I'm not going to be the judge of that. And of course, we still have people doing similar things today when we have people praying to God, or you have people manifesting stuff. Or they can use the charts of the stars with astrology to say that some matches are made in heaven or not. So again, all of these are ways that we try to invoke a spirit, a god, the elements in the case of the Native Americans or tribal cultures. And they were done to get some favors or especially to have favorable weather conditions. But this was needed, of course, because in contrast, they were not willing to deform the land permanently as they were only part of it. And that's just where we get to the Industrial Revolution and our time right now, the way that we look at our relation with nature now. Then we get to capitalism, as I often do. Capitalism is important to understand in three important elements, especially for this video. You have private property relations, commodification of land, and infinite growth. And all of them are a radical difference of all the other examples that I've given before. Think about private property. John Locke, originally, when the Americans came to the America, they thought of the idea of private property and they defined it in such a way that made Native Americans not entitled to the lands that they have been living on for hundreds of years potentially. The reason was, hey, we are new here, we want to say this is our land and we need to find a way to say, okay, you do not have any claim to it. The way they did that is say, okay, you can only call your name on the land when you have put blood, sweat and tears into the land to cultivate it, to change it in some form. For example, building a home or working the fields. Then it is yours. And of course that meant that the Native Americans did not own the land that they have been living on and were quite quickly driven out of their lands with, of course, all of the diseases that the Europeans carried that they were not immune for. So, private property meant that Native Americans did not have any claim to their land. Then you get commodification. Commodification, quite simply, is that something becomes a commodity. It is something to be bought and sold. You can think of your body with the noblest and oldest profession in the world. But you can also think of your time, when all of a sudden you can start being hired and being paid an hour to work for someone else. But land is the most important one here, because once you can say this is mine, it's quite weird actually from a cosmic perspective that you have a planet that is a few million years old and humans have only been around it for more than 20,000 years as humans. We've only lived on it and our lifespan were at that point never much higher than 70 years old or so. That I have the right to say that this part of the earth is mine and I can give it to my son or I can sell it to someone else and I can make other people work on it and pay them money for it. It's quite weird because then if we draw this further and you potentially get more and more and more people, then we're going to run out of land to give to people. Even without the problem of running out of land to give to people, it already presents a problem right now. Because if you have land and you've got leeches like landlords that only get money from other people living on their land, that is for whatever reason theirs, land itself only is valuable because you can extract money from it, just like landlords or having people work the land. The land has lost its intrinsic value. It doesn't have a value anymore because of the beauty that it has, or the value that land has not being cultivated by people. And then we can get to the last part of it, infinite growth, because then land is only useful in the money that we can make of it. The resource of the land are only useful for what it can bring us. It's not worthwhile to keep it in the ground, to keep nature the way it is. And this is where we get to the core issue of capitalism. It's a problem that we cannot overcome and can make anyone into an anti-capitalist if they are serious. Because we cannot grow infinitely and keep making profit, keep growing, using the resources out of the earth that are finite. So you cannot grow infinitely on a finite planet. This is a problem, of course, because even if you keep using the resource, and at the moment there is no fear that we're going to run out, at some point you will, and then what then? The moment we start running out of metals, we cannot reproduce them. It might have taken millions of years for the earth to create it, like with diamonds, with millions of years of pressure to create it. But other resources, is just a finite amount of it in the earth. So the moment that we take it out, we might make nice rings and watches, but it will exhaust the earth of that kind of resource. Even in 100 years, if we think of a newer way to use gold and we have considerably less gold to be had, well, then it's tough luck. So we put no monetary value in keeping a resource in the ground. We want to get it out because we can make money of it. We do not see the point of nature for its own sake. Especially when it is about gold, we do not put a price tag on keeping it in the ground. We only think about how much money it can make us getting it out of the ground. And you can see the problem there, because when we're talking about oil, also a finite resource in the earth, when we start burning it in the name of progress or keeping the economy going, it starts affecting our climate in very real ways by emitting, of course, CO2. Even when we talk about the potential benefit of burning oil because we need to keep the economy going, we're not even thinking about the downstream effects of the burning of oil itself. Knowing that climate change is making some parts of Africa, for example, impossible to live, impossible to grow any food on, and therefore there will be millions of climate refugees that will come to the places where they can actually grow food and live, or when there will be areas of the world that will just be underwater because of climate change. These are the things that you do not calculate in the benefit of burning the oil, but it's something that we're seeing right now. Even if you were supposed to be a very well-meaning capitalist, right? And you would say, okay, we can regulate capitalism and we could just have a carbon tax and limit the amount of usage of fossil fuels. It's going to be very difficult to actually get a number that discourages companies to pollute at all, and you cannot even calculate it properly. Just like I said, it's very difficult to calculate exactly the effects of burning fossil fuels here in Europe when it might have real climate effects somewhere in Africa. The Africans are not going to be able to go to Europe and say, this is your fault because you've been building so much new things and have been using so much fossil fuels in Europe. Even further, how do you even calculate exactly the damage that a company would do if they were to throw their acid waste in the sewers that would go down to the river? And maybe, just like in Avatar: The Last Airbender, it was a perfect episode for it, you have this acid waste go into the river, killing much of the fish or making it unlivable, where there is a fisher's village that will not be able to continue their way of life. Even if you were to somehow be able to calculate the damage that it costs to destroy the way of life of hundreds of people, how would they make the case that it's actually that much money? or that it is specifically this company doing it because the company has very expensive lawyers. You get into very real issues even when you're well-meaning, when you try to think of a number that is good enough in order to tax people, but do not question the fact that they keep using or think of a way of using that is more economically beneficial. The damage done might actually be very monetarily impossible, and it's kind of weird to even put a price on it. If you have, for example, the Keystone Pipeline that has to go through indigenous territories, that's a very real-life example. What pipes are known to do, especially if their construction isn't done quite well, they are under the ground, and what if they burst? The moment they burst, they infect the soil and they might pollute the river as well, and so the people that are living off the land cannot live off the land. Maybe the people downstream or that are using the hopefully purified water that hasn't been able to be purified correctly enough, how will you put a price tag on the fact that now a new generation of babies that were born malformed because their mothers had to drink poisoned water, how would you put a price tag on their entire lives now being ruined because they are now completely permanently deformed? So all of this is to say that even though you can be very well-meaning when you try to think of numbers, of taxes, of way to think of discouraging behavior of companies without thinking how to make sure that they just stop polluting in the first place, you get into troubles like you cannot calculate exactly what the damage is. They might not be liable exactly for all of the lives that they affect downstream, or it's kind of weird to even try to put a price tag on some of the irreparable damage that it causes, this behavior. And so, by now you might understand that the problem here is not that we don't tax people enough. The problem is not that we think that, we are not growing enough or we should not become more efficient in order to use less resources. The problem is that we should not use the resources sometimes at all. We should think about, hey, what is the maximum that we can use before we start permanently deforming the land and there is no turning back. We do not even value the land in and of itself for the beauty it has. We do not value the resources for them being in the ground. And so the first step that we need to do in order to try to actually tackle climate change is to think, hey, we should not be infinitely growing. We should think about ways that we can actually limit our damage and permanent damage to the planet instead of expanding it or expanding it lesser than. At some point, our game plan of infinitely growing, that the world is our oyster, is going to stop working. We cannot keep this up forever. We are almost like a parasite that is constantly sucking the resources of its host, and it's actually very suicidal because the moment that we have exhausted all the life energy of our host planet, we might either try to go to another planet like billionaires are trying to do right now to get more resources of other planets, or what is more likely is that when the host dies, as the parasite will just die. Actually, our problem with infinitely growing is very much like the meme of people thinking about the Roman Empire. Because economically speaking, the Roman Empire was always doomed to fail because it is based on infinitely growing land and using the spoils of war, the territories that you've conquered, in order to sustain your ever-growing economy. But at some point, you're going to have no more lands to conquer before every small hint of trouble might crumble the entire empire. In fact, we are so arrogant when our relation to land, well, let's go on a small side tangent. For hundreds of years, we have been so irresponsible with our land, is that for elites, it has been a status symbol to have a garden, a lawn, something that they could mow. It's completely illogical. You have land that you can afford not to use for any useful reason, to cultivate crops or whatever. It was a status symbol to flaunt your wealth. I can afford to have it and not use it in any good way. I can even pay people to make it the most useless it can possibly be. This problem of land only being useful to extract money from, again, is very, if you take a step back, looking about the idea of landlords. It's very medieval, right? You've got this world that has been here for millions more years than we humans have existed. And all of a sudden we started saying, this is mine. I can charge other human beings for living on this spot that my name is on. And still there's a class of landlords now that simply exist, that the only money they make is from asking other people to pay to live on that land. So, finally, getting back to the point. Our biggest problem in tackling climate change is that we think that we can dominate the earth and ask questions later. We do not value the beauty of the earth in and of itself, and we do not see the resources worthwhile keeping them there. And if we do not start asking questions of how much we use, how much can we afford to use instead of infinitely growing, we are going to keep running into the problem that either we expand like infinitely growing, or we infinitely grow a little less, but still grow to the point that we are going to use up our resources. Even if you agree with everything that I'm saying, that is a problem in capitalism on our planet. It doesn't mean that we cannot have civilization and we can build societies, mark our place on this world. But it does mean that when we do so, that we consider the effects that we have on the earth and in other places try to give back. And that's not by taxing people or getting more money and then using it for whatever we want. We need to consider that nature has to coexist with us. We need to have areas of forest and wildlife, and it's just there for the beauty of it. There's no price tag on it. We need to find ways to give back to nature to make sure that we do not overuse it and that we rely less on resources that are non-renewable so that we cannot get back once we use it. We should actually therefore grow up as a human species. We need to start really realizing that the survival of every other species of animal and bacteria on the planet is reliant on us not screwing up the planet that we all live on. We are not just the top of the food chain, we are part of it as well. And once we start destroying every part of the earth for our own benefit, not only will animals not be able to live on it, and you might not care about the animals as such, but we won't be able to live on it as well. And so, our baseline should not be to infinitely grow and expand the human species. We need to start thinking, how can we live in harmony with nature? How can we start stewarding the planet for every other species that is there and will be there in the future? We need to make sure then that we say, first is not infinite growth as a priority. We should think, how can we have humans have happy and fulfilling lives within our ability without needing to destroy any more than is absolutely necessary? And then our hope can become, when our baseline is, let's just have ourselves be happy and try to limit the amount that we use, that we can start actually thinking, how do we tackle climate change in ways that give back to nature? At some point, technology might even progress to the point that we are so efficient in growing food that we can start giving back to nature, doing repairs of the damage that we have done. Maybe even find a way to synthetically create the materials that we have been using and put it back, because we are guests on this planet. We have to cohabitate with all other species, and if we continue this and not radically change the way that we deal with it as a very parasitic house guest, there might not be a planet to live on any longer. There we go with another one. I hope that you liked this one because I was very passionate about it, as you can see, and we're going to talk about this topic many different times and hopefully being more passionate and easier to speak to the camera as I keep doing. So if you did and you want to support me, please engage with the video by commenting and subscribing. Especially answer me the question whether you think there is hope for humans or not and what we should do to change it. Might be a big question, but are you hopeful for the future? And so if there's nothing further, I hope to see you in the next one.